Greetings, everyone. You joined us for another episode of Counting on Chazin. And we're really excited because we have Chris Bavolack back with us today to talk about presenting financials to your nonprofit board. I got to say, Chris, this is a little tenuous of a conversation because this strikes fear in the hearts of a lot of nonprofit CEO and finance directors, doesn't it?
Yeah, it shouldn't though. I mean, it's something that a CEO or an executive director should pay attention to though. And it's something, this is a topic that's near and dear to me. I've worked with nonprofits my entire career. I've worked with many different types of boards, differences in sizes, differences in structure, differences in composition. And not every board, not every member of a board has finance and accounting knowledge. So that has to be kept in mind when presenting financials. And so it becomes, in addition to a science, a little bit of an art in presenting data so that you can ensure that the board is fulfilling its fiduciary role of overseeing the financial health of the organization. And, as we'll talk about a little bit, it's more than just spitting out the financials and putting them in front of them and saying, well, I gave them to the board. That's it. Now there's more that you should be doing, because everyone should leave a board meeting with an understanding of the financial status of the organization.
I love how you phrase that. And before we dig in anymore, let's reintroduce Chris Bavolack, Director of Finance and Operations, just in case you haven't heard him on one of our other episodes of Counting on Chazin. Chris has really come to us with so many great ideas. As you mentioned, your lifelong experience working in the nonprofit sector really sheds some light on so many of these topics. And again, if we haven't met, I'm Julia Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. Okay, I've got to step back a couple things because you said some things that as a board member and a trustee, I'm shaking my head going, yeah, I get this. I've been at the table when some of these things have gone on. And you talk about, we have concerns, obviously, about presenting information to the board. But one of the things that you say, which I thought was really interesting, is that the launching point should be knowing our board members. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means?
Sure. The makeup or composition of every board is very different. And if you're a board of a CPA organization, you're probably not struggling to find people who understand the financial statements. They might not know nonprofit accounting and financials as well, but they're familiar with numbers. Other boards, maybe not so much. And so you really need to make sure that you have at least one or two people on your board that really do understand and are comfortable with accounting and finance and working with numbers. But then again, you have to be really tuned into who else is on your board, because you don't want to leave them out. It's important for everyone to understand the financial health of the organization. So you need to find ways to communicate that information so that everyone can understand it.
I loved what you just said because I can see that like division in the room. Say you're working for an arts organization and you have people that, on your board that know a lot about arts and culture, but haven't really brought any financial strength, or I shouldn't say financial strength, but financial knowledge to the table. That can really cause some problems ultimately. And I thought it was really interesting, and I just want to touch on this briefly. You mentioned nonprofit accounting is different than for-profit accounting. So just because you bring somebody in that might have, a finance knowledge doesn't necessarily mean they're going to understand the nonprofit accounting, right? Because there's a different even vernacular and vocabulary that we use.
There is a little bit of a difference. I mean, of course, coming in with a financial accounting background gives you a head start, and you can quickly learn some of the differences. The balance sheet for nonprofits is called the statement of financial position. Then the profit and loss statement is called the statement of activities. There isn't equity in a nonprofit. There are net assets. Those are all things that are a little different. And there's some revenue recognition rules that are different for nonprofits that are different than the for-profit sector. And people need to be aware of that when reviewing statements. So you're right. Not everyone comes in with that background, but breaking it down and making it easy to understand the areas that are of importance to each particular organization. That's where the art comes in, because every single line of a statement of activities or every single line of a statement of financial position is not necessarily worth spending a lot of time on. There are key areas.
So I hear you, I almost want to use the word focus. I hear you telling us we need to maybe focus in on some specifics. And you use the word key indicators. Like, so talk to us a little bit about that, because what I'm hearing you say is don't just try and give everything out at once, but pick out some of the things that you think are a little bit more important, or I dare I say perilous, not just the
Mhm.
celebratory aspects, but what do
Well,
we need to be looking at for the future? So
yeah,
talk to us a little bit about that.
yeah, it is being conscious of the key indicators for each organization, and it is different from organization to organization. But fundamentally, the financial statements need to be created, they need to be produced, they need to be shared. So everyone, they do need to be, given to all board members on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, certainly on an annual basis. But it doesn't mean that every board member has to scour, again, every line of these statements. And I think, again, the art is picking out some of the key areas to focus on. For instance, cash is important to almost all organizations, and you want to be able to look at your cash position now compared to a month ago, but also particularly to the same time last year. How is your organization doing from a cash perspective? Do you have enough cash to move forward? And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. Other key areas might be, if you're an organization that takes contributions, what your pledges are. If your organization is a membership organization, what does the future look like as far as your membership revenue? Net assets are a very key area for nonprofits as well, to make sure you have the right balance of unrestricted and restricted net assets. And then on the statement of activities, again, which is like the profit and loss statement, you need to be looking at your key revenue lines. Is the revenue coming in at the pace that was expected? Or how are you doing budget to actual? How are you doing this year, again, compared to last year at this time? Those are all things that can be indicators that help you understand the health of your organization. On the expense side, again, what are your key expenses that really impact the budget? It's very easy for someone who is not necessarily financially inclined to look down a statement of activities and find a line with a variance and say, well, why is supplies over budget? And well,
Right.
it might be over budget, but it might not be very important to the functioning of the organization or the success of the organization. So again, it's really up to the people who are presenting the financials, whether it's the treasurer, the CFO, the executive director, a combination of all above, to lead the board members, again, to those key numbers in those statements to help them understand the success and the viability of the organization.
Right.
Now, I
Yeah,
also mentioned, cash flow. So let me just make sure I don't forget that
yeah,
point.
no, go.
Financial statements look backwards. And whether it's the statement of financial position, the statement of activities, or a cash flow statement, they're all looking at what happened. And again, there's information to be gleaned from that. But often a nonprofit needs to look forward a little bit and understand how are we going to do, in the next 12 to 18 months. So a lot of times creating a cash flow projection is an important exercise and something the board should also review. When is cash coming in? Where is it coming from? What are our outflows going to be? And are we going to have any times where meeting our cash needs is going to be difficult in the next 6, 12, and 18 months? And if there is, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to manage this? What happens in scenario planning? What happens if a meeting or our membership or contributions don't go the way we expect? What difficulties might that cause for the organization? When might that happen? And again, how are we going to deal with that?
I love that you said this, because at the core of it, Chris, it's really a conversation that dovetails to the information. And that conversation is somewhat, you know, management versus leadership. And when you're managing, the day-to-day stuff,
Mhm.
um, versus looking at the future, understanding trends, and kind of making strategic decisions, that's the sweet spot for a board. And I think a lot of times, to your point, I love what you just said. You can look down and say, well, why are we spending so much money on supplies or some ridiculous thing that doesn't really impact the greater health of the organization? So I want to drill down a little bit more about that, because I agree. And I've been there. You get thrown on the table a stack of reports and you're trying to figure out what to do with them. Talk to us about data visualizationers. We're hearing these
Mhm.
buzzwords, data viz,
Mhm.
and the use of graphs and charts. Um, what does that look like? Because that's not really in the past how we presented financial information to the board.
Right. Again, a lot of times, the financials are just given to the board and it's up to them to kind of navigate their way through and figure out what's important. I think, however you do it, whatever you can do to have your board focus again on those key numbers, those key indicators is helpful. It could be notes on the financial statements. It could be highlighting certain things. It could be comments. It could be creating a table that pulls some data out of the financial statements and breaks it out so someone can let's just look at how our conference did, profit and loss of that, because that's, brings in 40% of our revenue every year. So you pull that out and you make that a separate exhibit. You do create maybe graphs and charts that over time show our cash position or show our net assets or show our pledges for contributions, whatever those are, and you show bar charts or pie charts or whatever it is. And again, I'm not talking about hundreds or even tens of these. It really should be a little dashboard. When I say dashboard, it can be just a document dashboard, a PDF dashboard of 5 or 6
Wow.
charts or tables of information that you really want people to focus on and see and understand. That's the real important word, to need to understand what's behind these numbers that show the health of the organization. And if you can break it down that way and lead your board members through that information, it can make your meetings much more efficient. Your people can leave knowing that they understand what's going on. It doesn't mean they still won't ask some questions about a few other things, because some people like to do that. They maybe have some other concerns or are knowledgeable, but you might be able to really streamline your financial presentation. But again, I'm repeating myself, but most importantly, leave with a sense that people understand what they've just seen and read, and don't leave the board member shaking their head and say, I don't get any of that,
You
because
know,
that doesn't help.
I'm really I'm going back through my own history, board leadership, and I would say the room generally looks like this. The board members have been selected because they have leadership in their community, they have financial resources or connection to resources, and they're generally people who've been fairly successful and have large egos. I'm going to lay it out on the table, right? And so what happens, and this has just been my observation over the years, over decades, is that they're very reticent to say, I don't understand this. That they'll have questions maybe, but to really say, I'm not sure about this, or to reflect any amount of disconnect to the knowledge or the
Mhm.
process, they're more apt to be quiet and then ask questions later, in a sidebar kind of situation, which is so unhealthy. And so I really like the idea that you're saying to us, what's the bigger picture? Because I don't think a lot of financial presentations lead with that. They kind of throw all the information out, like the board's supposed to absorb it all and know everything, versus let's figure out some key points. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that as well, if Chazin and Company is seeing that you're subject to experts and accountants are being asked to look at what the future trends are,
Mhm.
which then allows for a deeper discussion. I mean, is that accurate, or should we really know everything?
Yeah, no, the financial discussion, the financial understanding should lead, more strategic discussions or be a part of more strategic discussions. Finance is not the only thing that a board or an executive committee should spend their time on. And that's why you want to be efficient with this, because some people tune out when you spend half of a board meeting looking at financials and they don't understand it.
Yeah.
So again, that's why you want to be efficient. You want to get the right information. Yes, of course, some people are going to be reticent to comment on things that they don't feel are their expertise, but it doesn't mean they should leave not understanding what's been presented to them. And sure, people who are more involved with finance and accounting on a day-to-day basis will ask maybe some deeper questions or take a little deeper dive into some things. So there's a little difference there to, understanding how much someone should know or someone should understand. They're not your CFO. They're not your accountant. They're not your treasurer, and a treasurer should have a deeper understanding and connection to all this. But they need to know enough to understand when the organization is prospering and when it may need some help or some adjustment, because it is the board collectively, probably at the recommendation of a finance committee and or an executive committee, that will then approve adjustments to a budget or adjustments to operations that help get an organization back on track.
I love that you said that, because in the way you're phrasing this, Chris, it's such an interesting conversation, because I don't think that this is the way boards have looked at reviewing financial information. I really think this is somewhat groundbreaking in how we can move from managers to being leaders and understanding, as we've been talking about some of these trends. You started off with, looking in the rear view mirror versus looking out, in front and seeing what's going on. One of the things that you bring up, and I really want to spend a little bit of time on this, is successful board oversight is an issue that really is founded upon the idea of letting the CEO manage and lead with these things. And you brought up in the beginning, looking at maybe some of these line items and freaking out, but the issue is really different. And could you talk to us a little bit about this?
Sure. Simply put, the board hires the CEO or the executive director to run the organization on a day-to-day basis. In order to do that, they need to have some latitude and some flexibility in managing the budget throughout the year. And that doesn't mean that any big changes to the budget or any big financial decisions wouldn't come through the proper process, finance committee, executive committee, board, for instance, to be approved. But the executive director is the one that sees things happen on a day-to-day basis and sees things change. And so, what we thought maybe in October or November when we approved the next year's, calendar year budget, for instance, might not be true still in May. I mean, things change so quickly, and someone may need to make an adjustment. So maybe we had $10,000 in travel budgeted, and and $20,000 in marketing, and because of a pandemic, travel isn't the way to go and digital marketing is, and so we need to shift some dollars from travel to digital marketing. Well, the executive director should have the latitude to do that and say, I see more opportunity here than I see there, so I'm going to stay within my overall budget, but I need to move money around. And too often I've heard an executive director say, they won't even let me move money from line to line. And I say, that's just wrong. You can't manage an organization if you can't do that. Now, still, if you need to increase budget significantly, and sometimes there's thresholds that the budget needs to increase by more than 10% or something like that, then you got to come back to the finance committee or something like that. Or if there's a big downturn in revenue expected, we need to talk about it. But the CEO and executive director needs to be able to run the organization. And then if they're not doing that effectively, there needs to be a discussion, during their annual review or whatever, but give them the flexibility and latitude to do their jobs. And then the board gets that reported on, however frequently they meet and how things are going. And but that's, again, it's keeping the board at that high strategic level and letting the staff run the organization.
Before we go on to my next question, and when I talk with you, Chris, you always get my mind firing, and I always end up getting all these questions. So I want to ask, that those guardrails of percentages of where you can navigate around change and manage. Are you advocating a discussion that's like we're going to have, a 5 to 10% rule that allows flexibility, or is that just something that is more a more natural discussion? I mean, how rigid should some of these guardrails be in terms of this aspect?
I hate to use the it depends, but it really does depend on the organization and the comfort that the board has and, and the size of the organization.
Yeah.
10% of $1,000 is a lot different than 10% of $500,000 in a budget.
Right.
So,
Okay.
um, I think it is a good discussion to have. Ideally, the executive director or CEO has the latitude that they need to effectively run the organization. And I can't say definitively exactly what that is for each organization.
Okay. Now, the next part of this I'm really interested in, and that is the strategy of information. And we talk about data
Mhm.
viz, we talk about presenting, key elements of information to our board. A lot of us have finance committees, and a lot of us have that grouping of people that are experts. And I'm wondering what your take is on, I would almost call it information butlering, meaning that you navigate more in-depth conversations to your finance committee and things of that nature, and then you pull out more specific things, and as you mentioned, more focused things. Is that an ethical issue or is that an efficiency issue? Talk to us a little bit about this.
Well, I think it is. It's a process issue.
Mhm.
It's an efficiency issue, and again, it's a knowledge issue. Your treasurer, my experience is the treasurer should obviously be someone who knows accounting and finance, has a general understanding of it, and really should be looking at data, I think on a month to month basis. And they should, I used to have month to month calls with my treasurer. We would go through the financials and we'd call out any particular issues. And then that information then would be taken to the finance committee, and the finance committee really does spend their time on finance and accounting, and they really talk more in depth. You've got more heads around the room that are talking about the issues and talking about strategies and what should be brought up the line. Of course, if the organization is doing great, the finance committee might come back to the next level. Maybe it's the executive committee and say, things are really on target. Things are going well. In other situations, they might say, we're a little concerned about an impact on a conference we're going to have. We think our revenue might be down 20%, and we have to manage for that. So it's sort of, again, different levels of in-depth in the finances at each stage. And then you get up to the executive committee. As I mentioned, the executive committee should not be spending their entire meeting on finances unless there's a real crisis to be discussed. The executive committee has other things to talk about within the organization as well. So they need to get an efficient delivery of information of, okay, what do we need to know about here, treasurer and finance committee? So they kind of wean it down and say, okay, everything's great, except we need to talk about this. Okay,
Right.
great, let's address this. And then again, in my experience, it's the executive committee that would take it to the board. The executive committee also sometimes has to make decisions for the board when the board is not going to be meeting, in a timely manner. But they could take it up the next level and say, okay, again, we've had the finance report. You've kind of seen the key issues we do. Again, we have this issue we need to address, and this is going to need, board input because it's going to be a fairly significant change to the budget than what we had. Or they might say, the change to the budget is not going to meet the threshold where the board needs to vote. So we've already approved this, and this is what we've done. It all kind of depends on the processes of that organization, what their articles of incorporation say, what their bylaws say, all of that. But it is heavier information, treasurer, finance committee, filtered information getting up to the higher levels. And again, with the board, knowing that everyone around the room is not a finance and accounting expert, it really needs to be detailed and explained to them in an easy to understand manner.
I love that you keep going back to this because you can be a subject expert on so many things and be a valuable part of a board,
Mhm.
but finance and accounting might not be one of those things.
Right.
And so understanding that, and to the very beginning of our conversation, knowing your board. It's such a fascinating way to look at how we're going to present this information, because hearing you talk, today, I'm reminded that, we can create strength with our board members as we educate them. We
Right.
get them to be more familiar with understanding this data viz, with understanding the
Mhm.
concepts, and not being afraid to say, okay, we're going to learn about something so that we can be better managers and better leaders. I
Right.
think is a really interesting way to go.
Right. All board members bring or should bring an expertise that you need around the table.
Yeah.
And they'll all grow as they'll learn about other expertise as well. But I mean, to your example, what if we had an arts organization and all their board members were accountants and finance people? Well, that might be great for the financials, but it might not be great for growing a performance schedule or a performance strategy or something like that. So, a board should again represent all the different types of expertise that the organization needs to effectively fulfill its mission.
Yeah, absolutely. Board diversity is not just ethnicity and gender, it's skill sets,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
understanding. You're right, and I love that you brought that out. We don't have a lot of time, Chris, but I want to, you've given me so much to think about, and I know for our viewers of Counting on Chazin, you've done the same thing. I kind of want to wrap this up, and this is going to be a super tough question for you, but I think you're up for it. How do we know if we're doing this right? I mean, how do we know if our board members are getting it? What
I
does
think
that
they'll
look
tell
like?
you. I think they will tell you. And, there's, again, I've been in board meetings at times where there's members that leave and they get on their plane and, they're just shaking their head and saying, that part of the meeting, I just didn't understand what's going on. They're going to tell you when all of a sudden the light goes off and they say, man, you presented that in a way that really makes sense. I get it now. They're going to say that. Or you're going to, ask around the table after presentation, was that clear? Does everyone understand the status of the organization? And I know sometimes you get people who just will nod because they just want to nod and they want to keep things moving. But I think I really do think when things go well and the light bulb goes off and it's really made a difference to someone, they will say that. And of course, you can do your own little polling, whether it's by phone call or by email or whatever. Just make sure, hey, we did this a little differently this time.
Mhm.
Was this helpful to you? And they'll let you know.
That's a great idea, because that would be such an easy and simple thing to do, especially if you are a nonprofit that has a board liaison, which I hope you do. That using that talent to just in a very easy and achievable way to say, did we present this information to you in a manner so that you can understand it? Because again, to your point, data viz is where we're moving, and
Mhm.
understanding that is going to be something that we need to really navigate and understand and do right. We really need to do
Yeah.
right by our groups.
And you actually made me think of one other thing, because there's a number of times where the financials have been presented and it's what you're supposed to present, but it's not what the board members want to see. Again, they're focused on key programs, key initiatives. They want to know how those things are doing. Sometimes seeing everything kind of thrown together doesn't give you the data or the picture you need, or a board member needs. Boards have other committees sometimes, and sometimes those committees want to see specific data. So also asking, have we shown you what you want to see or what you want to know, is a good question as well.
I love that. I love that. And I think too, um, when I thread this conversation to its conclusion, I'm reminded of that saying, you don't know what you don't know. And the more that we use these tools, I can see board members becoming like switching in the hubs a little differently and saying, okay, this is how I'm going to um, be more knowledgeable, have better information so I can be a better leader. I mean, it's
Right.
kind of an interesting path and trajectory. Wow, Chris Bavolack, Director of Finance and Operations, you always get me thinking, my friend.
Happy to do so. And isn't it funny that communication always seems to be the root of everything being successful? So,
And I love that you said that, because I think we separate numbers away from communication, which is such a big mistake. It's such a big mistake. We need to be less fearful of our numbers. And in the nonprofit sector, we oftentimes operate from that place of fear, because we're asking for money or we're trying to manage, limited resources. And so I love that you kind of turned the tables on us here for a little bit, so that we can be thinking about this. And you are right. Communication's everything. That's what Counting on Chazin's all about. Communicating from the actual experts at Chazin and Company, how our nonprofits can be stronger and better. And we are so excited, Chris, that you would join us today. We have a lot more to discuss about all things accounting, especially nonprofit accounting. It is so different. And it's something that really is a specialty of Chazin and Company. And so we're delighted that you could join us today. Check back with us. We have a lot more content that we know is going to help your nonprofit thrive.